repeatedly as people come in. Okay, I'll go on mute then until it's time for me not to be on mute.
Good morning and welcome everyone. So glad to have you with us this morning. We are going to wait a couple of minutes as folks come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us. Glad to have you with us this morning. We're going to wait one more minute as some more folks come in from the waiting room, and then we'll dive into content. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, we'd love to know who's with us this morning. Feel free to drop your name and organization. Just looking at the registration list, and you see folks from all over, so glad to have you with us. All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to today's session, The Great Resignation, Exploring Ways to Retain Employees. This workshop is offered by the Massachusetts Community Foundation Partnership. As you may know, the partnership is made up of 15 Massachusetts-based community foundations who have come together since the start of the pandemic to pool resources to strengthen the nonprofit community. My name is Kelton Artuso, and I'm the Associate Director of Programs at Philanthropy Massachusetts. I'm joined today by our presenter, Lynn Friendlich, who I'll introduce in a moment, and Jessica Holmes of the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network. Philanthropy Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network are pleased to work with the foundations to bring these resources to the Massachusetts nonprofit community. We're thrilled to be joined by Lynn this morning. She is the founder and principal consultant at Change for Good Consulting and Coaching. Lynn specializes in leadership development, human resources, and change management as a coach, facilitator, trainer, and consultant. She has over 30 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, working in a range of settings from large international organizations to small member-driven local groups. Most recently, she worked with TS&E Mission Works, where she served as the Director of Administration and Human Resources for over 15 years. Before we get into this morning's session, I did want to go over a few logistical elements. The first is that we ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you're able, we would love for you to turn on your camera so that we know who's with us today. And we understand if you're not able to turn on your camera, but hope that you'll engage with us that way. We also encourage you to share your questions, reactions, reflections in the chat box throughout the session. And you're also invited to vocalize your questions, ask your questions out loud using the hand raise feature, which you can find by selecting reactions at the bottom of your screen. This is an interactive session, and you'll have a couple of opportunities for small group discussion and breakouts. We're also employing closed captioning for this session. If you would like to add or remove the captions at any point, you can do so by going to the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and turning on or off the captions. We are recording this session and we'll make that available to you all, as well as the slides after the session. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat box. And with that, I think that's everything. So with that, I will turn it over to Lynn. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Kelton. Thank you so much. And thank you all. It's great to be here with you. I think we'll just dive in. You gave me a great introduction, Kelton. I wanted to just say a little bit more. This slide talks about my practice and about the services that we provide. But I actually think the most important thing that I want to share with you is that while I am an independent consultant right now, I have spent most of my career, which is 30 some years, working in nonprofits, primarily in leadership roles and in human resources, operations, administration. And so I share that to say that I've had a front row seat to addressing the challenges and trends that you are thinking about addressing too. So I'm happy to be with you here in that capacity as well. Our purpose today is to explore employee turnover and to talk about ways to address it. By the time we're done in our 2-hour session, my hope is that you will leave being familiar with some of the data about employee turnover, especially during the pandemic, that you'll understand why employees leave jobs, and you'll have considered some different approaches for retention. Our agenda really follows those outcomes. And as Kelton said, there'll be a couple of breakouts. This is an interactive session. I do have information and ideas to share with you, but I also want to give you all the opportunity to hear and learn from one another. So in that vein, I'd like to just suggest some community agreements as we get started so that you all feel you can participate, in a genuine and full way. And so the first that I'd like to suggest is that we have full participation. And I do understand having cameras off. We are all Zoom fatigued, but if you can find a place in your heart to put your camera on, I think it really helps us feel like we're interacting with each other, both for me as a facilitator, but when you're talking with one another. The second community agreement I'd like to suggest is that we really practice listening for understanding. So many of us listen and are preparing our response before we're even sure what someone else is going to say. I was once a participant in a session where the facilitator asked us to go around and answer some complicated question, and partway through people's responses, he stopped us and he said, "How many of you are actually listening, and how many of you are composing your response?" And the whole room went, "Oh." So since then, I've always really tried to focus on just being present and listening for understanding. From a confidentiality perspective, I'd like to encourage you to keep the specifics of people's stories between the people with whom it was shared, but certainly lessons learned, to take them with you. To the extent we can, let's focus on ourselves and speak in I statements and try not to generalize any more than we kind of have the firsthand knowledge about things we don't have firsthand knowledge about. Limiting distractions to the extent that you can. Again, I understand the desire and the need to multitask, but if you are able to be fully present with us for these 2 hours, we will appreciate it. And at the same time, I want to offer one another grace. Everyone needs to make their own decisions, and we don't know what's happening behind each and every one of our screens. And in that vein, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So let me just ask, is there anything else you want to ask of one another so that you feel like you can be really present, share what's happening in your organization, in your professional life? Can I get a Zoom or a physical thumbs up if people are in agreement? All right, that looks substantial enough. So we're going to start breaking you into small groups. I'm going to ask you, introduce yourselves, and then reflect on, why did you leave the last job you left? What were the reasons? And if you've left more than one job, why did you why did you leave those jobs? When you come back, we'll do a little reporting out. So be sure in your small group to identify anything you don't want shared back with a full group. And we'll give you 10 minutes for this conversation. We'll send you a warning when you've used about half your time. You'll get a 2-minute warning, and then you'll get a 60-second countdown before you're automatically zapped back here. Any questions before we move you into those groups? Okay, in that case, we will see you soon. Are we ready, Kelton, to open up the rooms? All right, we'll see you soon. There we go. No matter how many times I do this, I always find it so amusing when everybody just gets pulled back in. I can't help but think of Harry Potter. So welcome back. Hang on to the thoughts that came out of your conversations. I'm going to ask you to share them in a couple of minutes. But before I do that, I want to just share some data with you. We all, I think, intuitively feel, or many of us, that turnover rates are high, that it's hard to hire. But let me tell you what the research and data says. So first, the National Council of Nonprofits conducted a survey. And what's really striking to me is the blue bar at the top. Of the organizations who responded to their survey, 26% of them, a quarter of them, are reporting having a vacancy of 20 to 29%. So about a quarter of the organizations responding have about 25% of their positions vacant right now. So that data, I think, confirms what many of us are feeling and experiencing. You know, there's that big teal bar, 47%. So almost half of the organizations have very low vacancy rates, between 0 and 9%. But many of the organizations we work with are experiencing significant vacancies.
When we can't see your slides right now.
Oh no, it must have happened when you were in your breakouts. Sorry about that. How's that?
Perfect, thank you.
So you weren't seeing the blue in the teal bar. Now you are. Excellent. All right. Some more data. The Winkler Group did some research, and they found that the average workforce turnover rate right now is about 12%, but nonprofits are experiencing a higher turnover rate of 19%. That is noteworthy to us. Additionally, nonprofit HR talked to nonprofit employees, and 45% of their survey respondents said that they would be seeking new or different employment within the next 5 years. That number doesn't surprise me so much. 5 years is a long period of time, and just because people say they'll be looking for a new job doesn't mean there'll actually be job-seeking behavior. But what's striking to me is that about 23% said that they would be seeking employment outside of the nonprofit sector. So that's concerning to us. A little more data here. Job applicant shortages. There's a quote in the left-hand margin. An executive director I work with just said this to me last week. She was saying, we have 2 qualified applicants. Before the pandemic, we would have had 50, and now we have 2. And if you look at this chart here, you can see that when COVID first struck, the beginning of 2020, there was a real decrease in vacancies and job applicants. I think people were sort of in a security-oriented mode, but as time progressed, we see this record high of job applicant shortages. So that is all just to say that what you're experiencing, what led you to show up here today, isn't your experience in and of, your organization's experience or just your experience. That you're in good company. But now let's talk about seriously, what are you experiencing? Has voluntary turnover increased in your organization? You can raise your Zoom hand and share your experience with us. You can type it in chat, but I'm really curious about what the organizations you work with are experiencing. Is there more turnover? I see a little bit of head nodding. Does anybody have anything significant to share? Turnover of certain kinds of jobs, much larger turnover than you would have anticipated, or maybe no turnover. Maybe there's a lot of security in your organizations. I'll toss another question out there. You can answer that one. But I'm also curious about job applicants. Is it harder for you to hire? That's a little bit counterintuitive. If there's lots of turnover, it seems like there would be more people in the job market. But as some of that data showed, they may not all be looking for jobs, or may not all be looking for jobs in nonprofits. Anybody have anything to share?
This is Suzanne. I work for the Girl Scouts, and I would say that we are experiencing higher turnover, and it seems to be, what they tell me is that they weren't necessarily looking for other jobs, but other people have come to them and offered them jobs they can't refuse. So things that we can't compete with for whatever reason. And we are getting many fewer applicants, and applicants that don't match the qualifications that we state. It's like, I think there's a lot more word matching out there, keywords on Indeed and things like that, where you just get you get these random applicants that you just look at them and think, how would you be interested in this particular job?
Right. You named a dynamic I hadn't really thought about, but I've heard this as well, that because it's harder, there are more vacancies, and because it's harder to find qualified applicants, there's a lot more headhunting going on. And so people are being tapped and recruited even if they're not in the job market. And I've certainly heard from organizations I work with that in order to hire people, they're having to offer higher salaries than many of their current staff are being paid for similar jobs. So that can also make it hard for employers to match a competitive salary and to hold on to people who have an opportunity to go somewhere else. So thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? There's certain kinds of jobs you see people leaving and certain kinds of jobs you see people staying in. I see you have your hand up, Ed.
We've seen the most turnover probably in our sort of direct service staff. In particular, we're seeing a decrease in job applicants. We post to as many different job boards as we can. We have a special focus to try and post with diverse communities. And we find that it's really hard to get good quality candidates to apply. And I think as Susan mentioned, what we see most often is sort of the ability on Indeed to do a one-click application means that people just sort of run through the job postings and click on everything. And so you get people who are just wildly unqualified and you have no idea why they would even be interested in applying. And you lose a lot of time in sifting through those applications that are not even remotely qualified.
How frustrating. And you said that it's direct service positions that are seeing the greatest turnover and the highest rate of vacancy. It makes a lot of sense given the nature of what we're experiencing now. People who actually have to come to work and be on the front lines, I think are really given reason to pause. Nicolian, I see you have your hand up as well. I hope I said your name.
Hi, that is correct. You did. Lacolian, hi. And my apologies for being off screen. I'm on my phone and I don't know how to turn the video on. So my apologies, but I am, to your point earlier, I'm fully present.
Thank you.
But one of the things that we are seeing is it is very much in the breakout session I was in. I think Angela mentioned this as well. It's very much folks are in that early and mid-career age range, and then early and mid-career type positions. Those are the ones that on our end we're experiencing the greatest amount of turnover. It's been really a challenge for us to not only retain folks in those kinds of positions, but recruit people to replace them into positions like that, because there's so much in this kind of middle management and up positions that there's so much movement there that folks are able to, even with fewer qualifications, actually get a job in middle management and in some cases in senior management. And so there's less of an interest for folks applying for entry-level positions or middle management positions with a certain type of experience. And so it's been a really a big challenge for us on that side. One of the areas in which we have been thinking more about, to the earlier comment about quote unquote diverse communities, but probably I'm assuming means communities of color. That is an area that we have been a lot more intentional about, and we're actually having to, rather than send things out to individual places, we're having to identify folks and say, you know, we would encourage not only people of color to apply, but April to apply, and you know, Susan to apply, and Tyreek to apply, or whatever. Like, we have to actually be more more selective and I think more intentional about that part of our recruitment process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in some ways, you've joined the game that recruiters are playing by reaching out to individual people. You're doing it in a more targeted way to build a more diverse workforce, which makes a lot of sense. You know, you also named a dynamic that I think is important, that it is not completely, but early career folks who are leaving in those positions that are vacant, and for a whole host of reasons. We'll talk about some of them, why I think younger people in the workforce are finding the pandemic, this moment in history, even more challenging than the rest of us. So thanks for sharing that. Let's talk about why people leave jobs. And so here's where I'm curious about what you talked about in your breakouts. What are some of the reasons that you all have left jobs?
There's some comments coming into the chat.
Great. Do you mind lifting them up for us, Kelton?
I see career advancement, toxic management, work-life balance.
One reason that I often hear is a lot of organizational change. Sometimes people aren't up for the change. It looks like, Heather, you have your hand up.
Yeah, for more stability and time with my children, and to be able to focus in the aspect of my organization, and seeing that the time that I put in my organization, I can see the turnaround, I can see where it's profitable, I can see where it's benefit and the family lives it has changed, versus not able to see that change. You're working and wondering, you've been 3-4 years into the job and you're like, okay, I haven't seen any changes. But with you put in the time and effort in your organization, that 3 to 4 years, you see so much change in settings in where your goals that you had before you started that job starting to turn up in your organization. You're starting to feel more settled and try to find different aspects to better your organization and to expand it to reach as much family as you possibly can.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And as I'll share in a moment, not being able to see the fruits of your labor is often why people leave. And when you find yourself in a place there, you can stick around long enough, as you pointed out, you may then be able to have a different perspective on how your work is playing out. Anybody else want to share why you've left jobs in the past? Let's look at what the data says. So before the pandemic, here's why people left jobs. And this is some of what you've all touched on. Contributions not being valued, not seeing how your work is making a difference or is connected to mission. Money, people leave jobs because they need to or want to earn more money. I hear this a lot. There's a lot of concern about career growth. Small organizations in particular can't provide, a career path for people. Work-life balance is another reason that people leave. And also, people report leaving because they have challenging relationships with their supervisor. Someone said a toxic workplace, that can often be in the relationship with the supervisor. It may also happen in other parts of the organization. So that's why people were leaving before the pandemic. And this is why they're leaving now, for all of the same reasons. They're not being valued. They can earn more money elsewhere. They're looking for career growth opportunities that they don't have in their current position, work-life balance, or challenging relationships with supervisors. So if they're leaving for the same reasons, what's different? One thing that's different is that major personal events lead people to take stock of their lives, right? We know that intuitively, but making the connection to that human experience and the vacancies we have in our organizations, we may not have made that connection. There's some research that shows that when people approach work anniversaries, job hunting behavior increases by 6 to 9%. When they experience birthdays, especially significant ones, maybe 40, maybe 50, job hunting increases by 12%. In large social gatherings, I love this one, especially things like class reunions, job hunting increases by 16%. People are taking stock and comparing themselves to their peers or their perceptions of the peers. And although the pandemic is a public event, it's impacting us all personally. So there are more personal events leading more people to take more stock. And major public events lead people to take stock too. And what have we experienced? The significant, in many of our work lives or our lives ever. Maybe 9/11 was a significant, I don't know, but this is a pretty significant public event. Another thing that we're seeing is that baby boomers are retiring at record rates. Now, this is something that in the nonprofit sector, people have been talking about for 20 years. There's going to be a mass exodus of organizational founders, of baby boomers, and it really never played out that way until now. And I think that's for a number of reasons. I think people are working later into their lives than they have historically. I also think the stock market crash in 2008 meant that people's retirement funds were not as valuable. They had to stay in the workforce longer. And I think that this personal and public event, these events are leading baby boomers to decide, yes, now is the time to retire. And then I think that dynamics around remote work are playing out. And this is my own theory, so I'm curious what you think about it. I think that there are people who really value and appreciate working remotely. They're saving time on commutes. Their work-life balance is better, and the prospect of returning to work, even in a hybrid way, is leading people to kind of reflect and think about whether they want to do that. And I think that's contributing to turnover. I think the flip side of the coin is also true. There are people who've really struggled working remotely. That is particularly true for people who are earlier in their career. It's not only true for younger people, but it can be isolating. There are people who are just so extroverted that work happens best in person, and they haven't been able to replicate that on a Zoom screen. And there are plenty of organizations who aren't returning. I've got numerous clients who've just gotten rid of their office space. They're saving a lot of money. And I think so both sides of the coin around remote work can be leading people to leave. I saw some head nods when I raised remote work. I'm wondering what other people think about that. Jen, I see you have your physical hand up. Oh, but you're on mute.
As someone who feels responsible for other people's work lives as the director of an organization, I found we did okay, but I found it challenging to create team, to really get to know people, to create that wholeness that, you know, I felt we were proud of in the past. Not that it was always perfect. It wasn't, you know, at all, but really my skills were, you know, better, you know, personality better used in person, you know, as a manager, as a director, as a visionary, than it was for 2 full years on Zoom. And to create team, to create camaraderie, to create reasons to stay, because I don't think so that's one thing. I think it has to do with feeling connected to your coworkers, because people don't just stay at work for money. It is feeling at home, feeling meaningful, and also getting to know people's skills. Like somebody mentioned, are using skills. I like to use, even though we're small, when possible, people's other skills, but I don't even know the staff the way that I did. So I don't know what they have to offer, and it was harder to find the time. So it was just work, 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 survival, survival, survival over the last 2 years. And my role and my energy had an impact probably in some way on others, although it was also, you know, the rest of the team as well. That's one thing. And then now with money, really the salaries are like, have changed so dramatically. So, you know, and I know that that's going forward, having to look at that and what can you afford without sacrificing your mission, but you want to keep people. So that's going forward. You know, that's a reality, and the costs and now inflation. And if people can be pulled by a headhunter to somebody who can a salary that they can't refuse, then there has to be a lot of other reasons for them to stay.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about compensation in a few minutes, so thank you for raising that. But I also think you're naming something else. You know, from your perspective as an organizational leader, you don't know people, you're not aware of what their kind of extra job, you know, outside of their job talents are, how to put them to use. And I'm also hearing, particularly from early career folks, that they miss that opportunity, the opportunity to interact informally with more senior staff who they don't see on a day-to-day basis, they don't run into in the kitchen. And so they're missing that opportunity to be seen and to be known, and also to have that kind of relationship. So absolutely. Any other thoughts about the remote work aspect of why people leave? Anything we haven't hit on? And I was able to see Janet's hand, but I can't see everybody, so probably best to use your Zoom hand. Okay. All right. So if this is what's different, we're all experiencing significant turnover, having a harder time filling positions. What should we do? The first thing that I want to say is that as we're assessing the issues and we're thinking about how to respond, I think it's critical to bring a racial equity lens to our thinking. And that can't just be lip service. When we're looking at our own data and trying to understand why are people leaving, we need to look at it from multiple perspectives. Are people with particular identities more likely to be leaving our organizations? Identities, racial identities, gender identities, maybe, you know, career stage, other types of identities. And then as we're thinking about how to respond, and we're going to talk about some of those ways, we need to be kind of interrogating each one of our potential responses to see whether it will impact people disproportionately based on identity and whether that's desirable or not. So this is an important lens as we move forward. So some of the things to do around reducing turnover is first to understand the numbers. Do you have the data? Do you understand how it has changed since the pandemic and how it hasn't? Are you conducting exit interviews? And what is that data telling you? Are different people giving you different reasons for leaving based on identity? If you're noticing trends that are demographic, don't ignore them, but really work to understand the numbers. It's easy to react to the big number. We have 25% of our positions vacant, or our positions are being vacant, are vacant for 3 to 4 months before we can fill them, but kind of take a deeper dive into the numbers. Next thing that I think is important is values clarification and assessment. And here's how I think about this. I think mission-driven organizations have a vision of the world we're trying to create out in the world, right? And the more closely we mirror that image internally, the more closely we treat our own people the way we want people out in the world to be treated, the more credibility we have. And the more credibility we have, the higher employee morale and the lower turnover. I'm going to share a quote from Brené Brown. She talks about having values and really living them, not just talking about them. She says, one reason we roll our eyes when people start talking about values is that everyone talks a big values game, but very few people actually practice one. And it can be infuriating. It's not just individuals who fall short of the talk. In our experience, and this is Brené Brown's experience, only 10% of organizations have operationalized their values into teachable and observable behaviors that are used to train their employees and to hold people accountable. 10%. If you're not going to take time to translate values from ideals to behaviors, if you're not going to teach people the skills they need to show up in a way that's aligned with those values, and then create a culture in which you can hold one another accountable for staying aligned with those values, it's better not to profess any values at all. They become a joke, a cat poster, total BS. And I see lots of people nodding their heads. So it's one thing to have values, it's another thing to walk that talk, to live them. So let's just talk a little bit about how to do that. How do you walk the talk? Well, the first thing to do is to define your values. If you don't have clearly defined values, this is a good moment, an important moment, I think, to be clear on what they are. But having some words written down on a piece of paper isn't the same as really walking the talk. And so you want to be sure that everybody knows what the values are. I was working with an organization on establishing their organizational values, and part of our work together was about how will they keep those values alive. And there was a joke. Oh, let's put them on our coffee mugs. And everybody said, yeah, haha, that's so trite and trivial. I went back to work with them about 6 months later, and they had actually done that. They had actually put their values on their coffee mugs. And it was remarkable. What they said to me is, we all walk around with our coffee mugs all day. So we're sitting in a meeting. This was when we were still in person, at a meeting table, and the values are all there right in front of us. And it's kind of hard to not live them when they're all present there. So whatever works for your organization. It's also important to remember that as you're hiring, if you don't continually revisit the values, not just share them in writing, but really talk about what it means to live and look like them, you'll have newer staff who aren't as prepared to be successful in your organization. It's also important to not assume that they're obvious. That's one of the ways I think we perpetuate a white dominant culture in our organizations, is by assuming that everybody should just know, fill in the blank something. But unless we're really explicit and sharing information with everyone, there's no guarantee that everyone should know. And so that's particularly true around making sure everyone knows our values. But even knowing what they are isn't the same as knowing what it means to live them. Brené Brown talks about what are teachable behaviors. So if one of our values is respect, what does that mean? What respect means to one person might mean respect to something different to another person. Words have different meanings to different people. And so digging in and talking about what are the behaviors that we use to exhibit respect for one another, and what are the behaviors that aren't respectful, is an important piece of the work.
Lynn, Bob has a question.
Great.
He's wondering, do you consider values different than mission?
It's a great question. And probably different organizations and different consultants think about this differently. But I think of the mission as the reason for our existence. And the values are, as we go about doing our work, what are the hows and the whys that we exhibit that are consistent with that mission? Sometimes organizations have a vision too. So mission, then the vision is of the world that we're trying to create. And again, values are we doing our work in a way that's aligned with that vision? I hope that's helpful. Are there more questions, Kelton?
Not right now, no.
Okay. So you've gotten some clarity around what it looks like to live these values. And then you want to take a look at your policies and practices. You know, have you operationalized those values? Are there operational processes and systems that are misaligned? How about our practices? I'll give you a couple of examples. So I was working with an organization around their snow day policy. And again, this was back when people were working in person. And maybe 10 or 15 years ago, before everyone had a laptop and so forth, when there was a snow day, a lot of organizations would close down if they could. And it was just a snow day, just like for school. But over time, as we started having internet at home and laptops and the ability to connect into our organization's files and systems and servers remotely, the snow days started to shift and change. And this organization was trying to figure out what to do about that. And the proposal on the table was, if you can work at home, great, you should. And if you can't, for whatever reason, you have kids at home or you just can't work it from home, then you'll have to use paid leave time of a personal day or a vacation day. But when we looked at that from a values-based perspective, that proposed practice was disproportionately impacting younger staff and staff of color. The facilities people couldn't work at home. The receptionists couldn't work at home. And there's lots of data that shows us that the more entry-level positions that pay less, are more disproportionately held by people of color and by women. And so that policy wasn't aligned with their value around equity. And so they needed to take another approach. Another organization I worked with has a real commitment to work-life balance. And I'm sure you've seen this and you may have experienced yourself. The senior staff, the executives, were working outside of their 9 to 5 hours and sending emails to their staff at all hours. And so while they were professing we value work-life balance, staff were feeling like they were compelled to respond to messages at 9 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock in the morning. That wasn't the intention of the senior staff, but they hadn't really thought it through. And so they developed a practice of, if you are working outside of hours and you have positional power or other forms of power, timestamp your emails. Have them show up, at 9 in the morning, that sort of thing. And while it's not a secret, when you get a flurry of emails at 9 o'clock, everybody knows they were written at a different time. That was enough to convey, hey, we mean it when we say we don't expect a response. Anybody think of any other examples of organizational policies or practices that do or don't align with with values? That's okay, you're going to have a chance. Oh, go ahead, Janet.
I think some organizations, I don't think it's where we work, but the disparity of pay between the lowest paid person, the highest paid person is, I know in corporations now it's 100. It used to be like 10 times was a lot. Now it's like 100 and 1,000. But even in some nonprofits, what I see and just makes me upset is because I know you're only as good as the staff that you have. And I do think that longevity and positions of responsibility, I've come to understand how much responsibility you're holding your shoulders, different positions, but sometimes when people are being paid so much more, I think it's hard to walk your talk that way.
Yeah, it can be. And we'll talk about compensation again in a little while, but I'll say this now and I'll say it again. How you pay your people is really one of the ways that you walk your talk. Where you put your money says a lot about what's important to you as an organization, right? Well, so here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to have an opportunity to think this through a little bit. And so we're going to move you into breakouts again. You'll be with one person. If we have an odd number, there may be one group of 3. But have some conversation about, does your organization have clearly defined values? Do people know what they are? And how do you know that? And can you share an example of a way that values are lived in your organization, and maybe a way that values could be better lived in your organization? and also some thought about your response to the pandemic and how has that reflected values and how has it not reflected values. I am putting these questions into chat, so you don't need to worry about memorizing them. We'll give you 10 minutes again. We'll send you some warnings and we will bring then zap you back. Any questions about what you're doing when you get into your pairs? And again, we'll ask for some report out. So talk about what you want to share, what you want to lift up, and if there's anything that you want to be sure doesn't get shared with the full group, make sure that you're clear about that too. Okay. All right. Whenever you're ready to open the room, Kelton.
All right. And make sure that you don't have any groups of one.
Great. And can everybody see the questions in chat? Anybody not see them? Okay, good.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and open the room.
All right, we'll see you soon. Welcome back, everyone. So I know values is not a 10-minute conversation. You could spend a lot more time talking about organizational values. I just wanted to kind of lift it up to your awareness and your consciousness. I'm curious, I'd like to hear from someone who says, you know, in your organization, yes, people do know and understand your values. I'd like to hear about that. Anybody? How about people whose organizations have values, but, oh, Suzanne, I see your hand up because I can see you on my screen.
I guess I'll say, I mean, with the Girl Scouts, we preach values every place. We have a promise and law, and everybody, you know, it's like the ticket to membership, to admission. So I do think when we do problem resolution or anything, it comes back down to our promise and law. You know, are we courteous? Are we respectful? You know, we have all these things. And we also have core values, you know, about racial justice and inclusion and, you know, just core values, but not so many that people can't remember what they are. So we have it, we include values in our onboarding. One comment I made though in our breakout is that if you're not careful, sometimes they become so common, so repeated that they lose their meaning. People stop thinking about it. You know, oh yes, we respect everybody. Yeah, well, so what does that mean? You know, kind of what you were saying before. You have to really engage with them, not just know them, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. So that they're not just, you know, words on a piece of paper or on a poster. I think you're naming something that I think is extremely important. The word, like I said, you know, what does respect actually look like? It's a word, we all interpret it differently. And so to dig in and be able to say, well, here, when we talk about respect, we mean if we're having difference with someone, we don't talk about them behind their back, we go to them directly to get really clear about what those look like. Anybody else have examples of, Christine, you have your hand up.
Hi, everyone. So I'm in a little different place because I am with the city of New Bedford. I'm a municipality, not a nonprofit, but it is a nonprofit. We do have, when our mayor came into office 10 years ago, he created a task force assigned with creating a statement of values for the city. So he came into office not as never been a politician before and out of the private sector. And so had, you know, that type of, let's be a little bit more businesslike in the way we do things. And that was important. He didn't contribute to it. It was a outside team of other departments across the city that created it. So we have this great statement of values, and every new hire we give a copy to. And annually we do an award ceremony where department heads can nominate somebody who exemplify those values, and it's a great ceremony. But in my conversation that I just had in our breakout session, we don't, I don't think it's on everyone's mind. It's not something as that people are thinking about every day, and it can be I think it needs to be more of a reminder to every employee, not just on the department head level, to think about those things, and not just human resources. When you're hired, you're given this form, and it's not just on a frame on a wall. So I think, like, coming out of this, I'm going to circulate it, just send an email around with a copy of the document. And then maybe instead of just, the annual award that the department heads nominate someone, maybe I can just pick out, when I have examples of somebody, one of our employees doing something, just send out an email saying, hey, great job with this particular value as an example. So I already have a takeaway from today. So thank you.
That's great. What a good idea. And I'm so glad you got a takeaway. Thanks for sharing. Angela, nice to see you.
Good to see you too, Lynn. Yes, in my little breakout, both of our organizations have a articulated value about sort of, learning, individual learning, progress, organizational learning, creating space for that for all employees to contribute toward that. And in our discussion, we talked about that one of the ways to exemplify that is to be really intentional about showing that the organization values the input it receives. So maybe that's reporting back, we heard this and this is what we did with that. I mean, that's a big cultural practice change, right? That's not always easy to do, but that struck me as a really great takeaway of how do you actually show that you are supporting people's learning and that the learning is actually being taken into the organizational structure in some way.
Yeah.
And so valuable feedback.
That's great. And you're exactly right. And it's actually, you'll see a slide in a couple of minutes. We talk about how important it is when you're seeking input to be really clear with people about what you heard and how you use it. And that's an important way of living that value. So thank you. Elena.
Hi. We also have as among our values, learning is one of the top ones. So very similar to Angela, learning and collaboration as a coalition. Both of those things are really important. And for us, we try to live our values by embedding it in our processes. So we have a regular staff meeting where we use the time to discuss challenges. It's not just reporting out. It's like, okay, I'm working on X and I'm struggling with Y. And as a team, we talk about all of the things, right? All of the challenges. What are some strategies? How can we do this? Who can take on what? So it's very team oriented that way. And also really believe in sort of the individual learning. And so, paying for our teams, our staff people to go to trainings that they're interested in, sharing things. When I get a lot of different things that come across my desk, and I'm constantly like firing them off to various members. Hey, are you interested in this? And then the organization pays for it, obviously, like if it's within reasons and budgets, but it's a clear priority and so it's signaling to them that it's a priority for us.
Great. Yeah. And like we said, where you put your money is a good indication of what's important to you. And if you say that professional development and learning is important, can you demonstrate that? Excellent. Thank you. Heather. Oh, you're still on mute.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
My value that we talk about in our group was that since we do a lot of footwork, we try to have a meeting before each person go out and to just reflect on the value of why you're doing this, what you're given and how you're given, how you're packaging the food and everything, the quantity that you're using. Do it as if you were on the other side receiving that bag. You were on the other side where, because a lot of people that my organization has given to, and children we have provided tablets for with the pandemic in Jamaica and here, it was very hard for them to go to school and they didn't have any connections and so forth. And online learning was a little bit different because the teachers weren't used to the online learning. So they have to get used to that as well. So when we go out, we try to say a little prayer before we go. And it's very heavy, because when you go and see the conditions that people are living in, it reminds you that the little things that you're able to get, a cup of coffee, a warm blanket, you know, being in your house, being in your bed, is so much valuable that other people are not able to enjoy. So we try to remember ourselves, as it doesn't matter if the organization is not pulling in as much funding as we supposed to, or getting the funding, but remember how that person is going to feel on the other end when they receive that bag, and how you're going to feel the gratification of that person feeling rewarded and feeling worthy, because for them to even ask for help, it's a lot that they have to build up that courage to do. And for them to receive, it's also a lot. So I always tell them to have a pleasant smile on your face, and just remember that what you are going through, it's bad, but the person you're giving is much worse. So if you're able to put a smile on your face, it lifts their spirit and their momentum of receiving what we're given.
That's beautiful. What a great way to remember why you're there and what's important, to put yourself in someone else's shoes, particularly the people that you're serving. I really appreciate that. Now, some of what I want to say about values is they're always aspirational. No organization, no individual lives them perfectly, but being really clear about what they are and continually finding ways to ensure that people understand them and understand what's expected of them keeps them present. You know, another way would be to include commentary about values in performance reviews, for instance. To, depending on what they are, maybe include them in your job posting so people understand the culture that they're considering joining. And certainly you can design interview questions around those values and keep them alive from the very first time you have contact with someone, you know, throughout their employment career with you. You know, when I showed the slide about why people leave jobs, and I think one of them was not feeling like their work or their contributions were valued. You know, some of what's in line with that I often hear from people is that they don't feel like their organizations are living their values, or that their personal values aren't aligned with the organizational values. What I think organizations can do is, like I said, be really clear about what those values are, keep them present, but also acknowledge that it's aspirational, and acknowledge the ways in which you can do better. If we're only talking about values, I think we're setting up expectations that we're all going to be perfect, and that's not human nature under the best of conditions, nor is it organizational nature. But to be conscientious about striving, you know, to continually, you know, get all of your processes and your practices more and more closely aligned with values, I think goes a long way in terms of giving staff confidence that you're walking their talk.
I'm not sure if you mean to have slides up, but if you do, we can't see them.
Oh, again, I wonder why that is. It's coming out of the breakout rooms. Thank you. And there we go. So this is, you didn't miss anything. There we go. Still the slide with the questions, but moving on, I do want to move on, and you can see the slides now, right? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
So that is clarification and assessment. Another thing that you can do to reduce turnover is to conduct stay interviews or stay surveys. And I wonder, I was going to do a poll here, but it's not, I find polls to be impersonal. Can I just see a show of hands? You know, are you doing stay interviews or conducting kind of stay surveys? Seems like there are a few people doing them, not so many. You know, so this is, you know, practice we don't think about when we're not worried about turnover, but it's actually, I think, a great practice. And you can ask the questions that relate to why people leave their jobs. So you can ask folks, you know, in your opinion, is the organization living its values? In what ways? And how could we do better? You can ask, do you understand how your work connects to the larger mission, to the vision we have for the world? You can ask whether they feel like their opinions matter. Do they feel seen? Do they feel heard? Do they feel like they belong? You can ask them about their supervisory relationships and their relationships with peers, and also about opportunities to grow. And that way you're not guessing. And why are people leaving? Why are people staying? If you're doing exit interviews and you're doing stay interviews, you have some real data so that you can ensure that any efforts you make to increase retention are targeted, well targeted to the dynamics, the particular dynamics in your organization. And when you do this, when you collect data from people, here's what I foreshadowed this. It's really important to share the data back. If you just ask for information and people have no idea what you're doing with it, it can lead them to, it just sort of magnify that feeling that my opinion doesn't matter, my voice isn't heard, even if you are hearing it. And somebody said earlier, I don't remember who it was, really letting people know, here's what we heard, here's how we're using it. Helps people feel like they continue to be connected to the organization. And then there's assessing compensation. So this has come up a few times already. And as we said, we know that people are leaving jobs often because they can make more money elsewhere. I'd like to share a little bit of data with you. This slide on the left compares the consumer price index, so what it costs to live, with the average hourly earnings of employees. Now, this is all employees. It's for-profit, not-for-profit, customer service, it's everyone. But what's notable to me is that our wages are not keeping up with the cost of living. And as gas prices increase now, I think we're going to see even a bigger gap between what it costs to live and what we're paying people. The chart on the right, I think, is really important. And what it shows is that since 1980, the top 1% of earners, and again, this includes the corporate world, have seen 160% increase in their wages. And the bottom 90%, which is probably all of us working in the nonprofit sector, we've seen a 26% increase since 1980. And so for many reasons, our salaries are not keeping up with the cost of living, and resources are being funneled to the most highly compensated people in our culture. And so individually as organizations, we can't rectify that, but I think it's an important backdrop to have when we think about compensation. So compensation structures do three things. One is that they reflect organizational values. They're a great place to live your values, to bring them to life, to walk your talk. They attend to internal equity. How are you paying different positions in relationship to one another? How are you paying different people in relationship to one another? In many nonprofits, there's practically a job description, a unique job description for every employee. So how do you pay your community organizer in relationship to your accountant, in relationship to your trainer? Apples and oranges, but a compensation structure gives you some guidance around that through the lens, ideally through the lens of values. And then how do you pay people in relationship to one another? If you have two people having similar jobs, similar levels of responsibility, if one has been there longer than the other, should there be a pay differential? There's not a universal answer for that. That depends on your organizational values. So what role does tenure play? What role does performance play? Compensation structures give you guidance around things like that. If you're going to assess your compensation, you want to look at how are your wages comparing to the market? Yes, Jessica.
Lynn, not to interrupt, sorry, but we had a question from Dawn a little bit ago. That's I don't know if the staff would share candid, honest answers to those questions with me, their supervisor. Any ideas on how to conduct stay interviews, maybe an electronic survey where they can remain anonymous?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of it has to depend on the size of the organization. I think in larger organizations, you could have someone more neutral doing stay interviews, someone from HR, that sort of thing, maybe hire a consultant. In smaller organizations, it might make more sense to do a survey so that people feel like their answers really are anonymous and that they can be frank. So that is a dilemma. I think explaining up front why you want the information, how you use it, may also help people feel more comfortable or safe sharing information so that they recognize it's not about them personally, that you're trying to get a handle on kind of the bigger picture. So a real issue though. Anything else in chat you want me to answer before I plug forward talking about compensation?
I think that's it so far.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So how do your wages compare to the market? This is a tricky one because market data is at least a year old. It gets collected, it gets, analyzed, and then it gets published in nonprofit compensation reports. And we know that wages have changed dramatically, but still getting a handle on how your wages compare to the market. There are some really good resources out there. The Nonprofit Times publishes a good one. TSNE, where I used to work, has a database you can find on their website for free. Plug in the name of a position, any other information you want to share, the size of your organization, the field of service, and get data for that position. It's outdated, but you could, it's there as a resource. And then, how do your wages compare to the market, and how do you want them to compare to the market? Now, I got into we'll call it a friendly debate with a board chair once of a nonprofit who was sincerely saying to me, I don't understand why we would want to pay someone 1 penny more than the mean salary, the 50th percentile of data. If that's what it takes to be competitive, then that's all we should be paying people. But again, let's look at values. We know that nonprofit wages are depressed, and particularly for our more entry-level employees. If we're not paying a livable wage, regardless of what the market says, are we walking our talk? I worked with a direct service organization, about a big one, about 300 employees. And one of the things that we discovered as we looked at their compensation, and they knew this, was that their lowest paid employees were paid so little that they qualified for the services the agency was providing. And so, how does that represent values? What does that say about organizational values? In that instance, it was a much more complicated situation, and it had to do with how they were being funded. But for those of you who are funders, this is also something to be thinking about. Are our grantees paying a livable wage? Paying staff a livable wage can reduce turnover and really contribute to organizations being effective in meeting the deliverables that they're funded for. So that's a piece you want to do when you're thinking about your compensation. How are staff paid in relationship to one another? What are the job factors that you use to differentiate between one job and another? And this is a really important place when you're assessing current reality to look at, are there differentials related to race, gender, other forms of identity? When I'm looking at compensation, I talk about slicing and dicing it in lots of different ways. So looking at how people in similar job groupings are paid and seeing whether there are any inequities, looking department from department, are there department leaders or supervisors who are more conservative with their resources than others? And is that showing up in how people are being compensated? I'm going to look at it in multiple ways. This is, again, a way to ensure that your compensation structure reflects your values. And I also really want to encourage people to be as transparent as you can be. And I'm not necessarily talking about publicizing what every individual employee makes, although there are some organizations that do that. I don't know if there's anybody from Resist on this call, but I know Resist publishes their salaries right on their website. That's extremely transparent. I think that's a great practice if it's aligned with who you are. It's not necessarily what I'm encouraging you all to do. But when people understand how salary decisions are made, and if they think they should be earning more money, as long as they feel confident that decisions are being made equitably, they're less likely to be concerned with compensation. Now, everybody has to be able to make ends meet, and that will be a challenge that some of us can and some of us can't meet, depending on our financial situations within our organizations. But lack of transparency, when people don't have information, they fill those voids with their own narratives. They make up the answers. And so, everything you can do to prevent people from having to do that by providing information, I think contributes to morale around compensation. Anything else you want to ask or share about compensation? Another thing you can do that I hope will reduce turnover is really train and support supervisors. Supervisors are where the rubber meets the road for most employee experiences, right? They're responsible for putting a lot of what we've just talked about into practice, and they're responsible for bringing those values to life in their teams and in their individual interactions with their direct reports. So training and supporting supervisors, I think, can really contribute to morale and retention. So some of the things that you might want to do: think about creating a job description for supervisors. Most people are promoted into supervisory roles because they're really good managing people, right? Yeah, no, most of us are given supervisory responsibilities because we know how to do our jobs well. And in a nonprofit environment, somebody's just got to do it. We'll just tap you because you've been here for a long time. And so very few of us have been told explicitly what's expected of us as supervisors. So I really encourage organizations to create a job description, to put it down in writing, and not to just share that with supervisors, but to share it with all staff, so that staff who aren't supervisors know what they can ask of their supervisors, what they can expect of them. It's a place where you can walk your talk and live your values. I think it's also really important to establish explicit expectations regarding one-on-one supervision. When I started doing this work about 20 years ago and training supervisors, I would ask, how many of you work in organizations where there's an expectation that you meet regularly one-on-one with your direct reports? And very few hands would go up. That has changed dramatically over the years. And I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm not taking credit for that, but I think the whole concept of supervision has evolved in the nonprofit sector. But if you don't have that expectation, it goes a long way. What I like to say is it's in those one-on-one conversations where the magic happens. It's those conversations where we can assure people that their contributions do matter. We can attend to any of the kinds of other issues that might be coming up, leading them to think about leaving. And we can focus on professional development. I think a rule of thumb is, at least half an hour every other week. And then depending on the nature of the work, the nature of the relationship, more frequently may make sense. Rarely less frequently makes sense, but sometimes, with relief staff or people who are only putting in a few hours a week, maybe you meet monthly. But really think about what that is, establish an expectation in your organization, and then be sure that supervisors are living up to it. Provide training for supervisors. There's lots of great training out there. I'll give a plug for TS&E's training, and to be transparent, I am one of their trainers, but they do supervisor training right now over the web. I know the Management Center out of Washington, D.C. does great training, and you might even develop your own trainings for supervisors. What is it that you in your organization expect of them? Something that I've been doing recently is creating learning cohorts of supervisors, and I've done this both with supervisors from different organizations and within an organization, so that people have an opportunity to talk about and practice and reflect on putting what they've learned in the training into practice. How many of us go to a training, think, yeah, this is all great, and then we put our training materials and what we've learned on the shelf, and we go back to doing things exactly the way we've always done them, because that's easiest and most familiar. But learning cohorts can really encourage people to practice new behaviors. So that's something you might want to think about. And when we're evaluating staff, we should also be evaluating supervisors. The job description is a great way to do a performance evaluation around supervision. If this is what we expect from people, let's talk about how well as a supervisor you're doing kind of in each of these areas. And then model. I can't tell you how many times I've trained supervisors and they say to me, someone in the group says to me, yeah, this all sounds good, but my supervisor doesn't do this for me. So why should I do it for my staff? Which I think is a faulty argument to begin with. But the fact of the matter is, those of us with more positional power, other forms of power, how we operate does really set an example and a tone for everyone else. So if we're expecting lots from our supervisors and we are supervisors, we should be supervising in a way that's aligned with those expectations.
It looks like we had a question from Bob come in. Do you suggest having wage levels and pay grades known within the organization?
I do, absolutely. For the reasons that I talked about earlier. Anything else?
Not so far.
Okay. Anything else you've tried or thought about around supporting, kind of high quality supervision in your organizations? I will say I've gotten some recent pushback around the term supervisor. It feels really structured and hierarchical, and it is. My perspective is that as long as we're operating in organizations that actually are hierarchical, we should be transparent about that. And I discourage people from kind of blurring the lines and, not talking about supervision, but we'll just have a little check-in. I think supervisors have positional power. They get to decide how someone spends their time and evaluate, whether or not they're being successful. And I think if we sweep that dynamic in the relationship under the rug, we're asking for trouble. Now, there may be some organizations that are structured differently, in which case this may not make sense, but I think most of the organizations I come into contact with are still functioning in a hierarchy, or designed hierarchically. It doesn't mean that there's not lots of participation and input from staff at all levels, but most nonprofits are structured that way.
Allison asks, what are your thoughts on training staff to manage up?
Yes, I think it's a great practice. Some of the training that I do for supervisors, I also do for staff. So, a module on giving and receiving feedback. That's really valuable for supervisors. The receiving part and the giving, it's also really valuable for staff. What those modules look like are different. When we're training staff, we really have to really shine a light on the different ways that power show up and how to navigate that when giving feedback. But I think training staff how to get the most out of their supervisory relationship can be really valuable. It is a relationship. There are two people involved in it. And while the supervisor is responsible, I think, for the dynamics and making sure that it works, they can't do that alone. It still is a two-way street. Anything else you've tried in your organizations to support, high-level supervision? Or any questions? Let's go back to our list of things to do to reduce turnover. Prepare for generational changes. So as I said, baby boomers are leaving the workforce. Workforce is, now being led more by Gen Xers. Millennials, now the Generation Z, the youngest in our workforce, are coming to work with different expectations. And that's nothing new. Every generation has come to the workplace with different expectations. But some of the places we're seeing tension right now are where expectations are really misaligned. So for instance, I think millennials are really focused and concerned about having a career path and want to understand, how long do I need to do this job in order to move into the next job? What do I need to do and learn in order to move into the next job? And what is that next job? And so I think we need to be prepared for that. Many small organizations cannot provide career paths. That doesn't mean that we can't support our staff in their career development. And this is a tricky tightrope to walk. Sometimes we really need to help people build and develop skills so that they can move on into the next organization. And in this moment in time, when we're trying to reduce turnover and we're worried about vacancies, that can feel really counterintuitive. But I think better we support people in their growth and development than we hold them back and then they leave out of frustration. And if you can become an employer with a reputation as doing a great job providing professional development opportunities, it may make it easier for you to fill vacancies. And so helping people develop their careers is about sending them to training. Someone said we have, lots of resources and we send people to trainings. I think that's a big piece of it. But there are other things we can do too, either in addition to sending people to trainings, or if we can't afford to do that, other things we can do. Can you give someone a stretch assignment where the risk isn't too high, but they have an opportunity to learn new things? If one of your staff is thinking about someday wants to be an executive director, but they're working with you in programs, can you match them up with one of your fundraisers and give them an opportunity to go on a major gifts visit so they can see what that's like? When I was working with a more junior consultant, the consultant associate, one of the things that I had them do was, they were a great editor. So I had them edit all my consulting proposals and all my consulting reports so that I got great feedback and edits, but also they really got a good chance to understand and look at what those kinds of documents look like, so that when they took the next step to take on some of their own consulting clients, they had some experience with proposals and with reports. Think about ways you can build those opportunities into the work itself. Different generations have different expectations around flexibility. And I think that the pandemic and for many of us who are working remotely or have a hybrid arrangement, flexibility has really come into the forefront. I think millennials believe deeply and have experienced the ability to do their work in different places at different times of day. And many of us who've been in the workforce longer have more traditional ways of thinking about work. We all work at the same time. And before the pandemic, we largely worked in the same place. And so we need to kind of think about that. What about our ways of working contribute to our success? Where can we be flexible? Where can we be open? Where can we think about things differently? And to engage people in that conversation. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to get exactly what they want, but to be open to thinking about things a little bit differently. And I do think that the pandemic has opened up new ways of thinking about work for all of us. And younger workers want organizations to take a stand on issues that are important to them, on racial equity, on social justice. And for some organizations, that is a natural extension of what they do. For some organizations, it's completely inappropriate. And then for most of us, we're sort of in the middle and we're sort of stuck. Like, I want to say something as a leader of my organization, but I'm not sure what to say. I'm not sure if it's appropriate. Should I be the one saying it? And so we tend to avoid all of that and pretend it's not happening. And I think that when people leave because they don't see the connection between what they're doing and their work, or because they don't feel that their personal values are aligned with their organizational values, that can be really frustrating. So I encourage us all to kind of face those issues head on, recognizing that how we respond will be different organization by organization. Those are my thoughts about reducing turnover. What kinds of questions do you have, or other experiences can you share? And Jessica, it looked like you were going to read something from chat.
I was just going to say, we had a couple come in. The first, I think you touched on a bit, but do you have a good resource for helping supervisors learn to be a good coach? Is the first.
There is a book about supervision and coaching that I think comes out of Compass Point. It's on my bookshelf behind me, and I can probably find the name of it and maybe send it to you, Jessica, and you can share it. I do think that the trainings, I'm aware of the trainings that I facilitate, but also I think the Management Center does really good trainings, tap into different approaches for supervision, coaching being one of them. Part of my curriculum is about recognizing when a coaching approach is a good match for what someone needs and when you need to use a different style. But yes, we do talk about coaching there as well. What else?
The next question is a little longer. Brandon asked, do you have any suggestions to get buy-in from staff as well as supervisors about professional development? Do you feel developing a concrete succession planning system should be implemented for all levels of employment within the organization?
Two great questions. Read me the first one again. I was focusing on the second one.
Sure. Do you have any suggestions to get buy-in from staff as well as supervisors about professional development?
About professional development. Well, one thing that I'll say is that not everybody wants professional development, and sometimes that's okay. I worked with someone who had been in the same accounting position for 27 years, did not want to progress in the accounting team, did not want to progress anywhere else, and did not want to leave the organization. And to my knowledge, she's still there in that same role. And so I think one of the ways to get buy-in around professional development is to be talking with each person about where they see themselves, in the future, what they think it will take to get there, and to really respecting and honoring each individual's own career path. I think in order to have those conversations, frankly, we really need to build trust. And I think real key to a successful supervisory relationship is mutual trust and mutual respect. And often that means a supervisor very intentionally establishing trust across difference. Certainly there are power differentials, but other kinds of difference as well around identity. Without that trust, it's hard for someone to say, I'm really happy here now, but in 2 years, I see myself going back to grad school or taking a turn in the for-profit world. But when you've got that trust, I think it's easier to have those conversations, and that way you can build professional development plans or opportunities that are employee specific. I think that's the best way to get people to invest in it. In terms of succession, sure, it would be ideal if we had a succession plan for every level of position. I think that's a great aspiration. I think probably what's most realistic is to think about which are our most critical positions to our ability to continue to operate, which are the ones we're going to have the most difficulty filling if there's a vacancy, and at least prioritize succession planning for those positions. Not necessarily at the exclusion of other positions, but certainly that would be the place to start. Are there other questions, Jessica?
It looks like we don't have any more questions. We have a comment from Leslie, I think regarding the reducing turnover slide, that they say, as someone who's worked full-time for a long time, I'm interested now in part-time flexible work, but often the jobs I'm qualified for are full-time.
Yeah. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I hadn't thought about that when I was preparing this, but I think one of the things we can do as organizations is, really think carefully about our job design. And if we're having difficulty filling a full-time position, could it be split up into 2 part-time jobs? Or could it actually be done in a part-time job if we took this one aspect out of it that's not really that important? I'm not opposed to people applying for full-time jobs and being frank from the very beginning. I'm actually not interested in working full-time, but I'd love to talk with you about how we might be able to do this job in a part-time capacity. Not everyone's going to want to have that conversation with you, but in this environment, you're probably more likely to find employers willing to have it than you might have in the past. So great question. Anything else?
Not at the moment, no.
Well, so I'm just curious, what other ideas do you have? What have you tried to increase retention? What have you tried to fill vacancies? What are you contemplating but haven't tried? You've heard what's in my head. I'd love to hear what you all are thinking. And I'm sure we can learn from each other. Allison.
MassBike has been doing a fair bit of hiring at like 50% time or 30 hours a week as one way really to meet sort of budget needs. And there's been a lot of question about if that's working and if there should be examination of adding in more hours for existing team versus adding more part-time roles. So that, but the sort of the tool MassBike has been trying is a flexibility of not only thinking about full-time roles.
And so in terms of thinking about all of the work that needs to be done and kind of divvying it up into job descriptions, has it been challenging to create part-time jobs, or has that been a smooth process?
I think for a small nonprofit, it is challenging for it to feel to people they can get everything they need to done in part-time, and then also challenging to decide, do we hire more part-time people for more things we need, or add more and bring on more hours for individuals? And it's very much a work in progress.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a little bit like putting a puzzle together, and it's about what MassBike needs, but it's also about what different employees want. So yeah, congratulations for actually being willing to take that on. I think it's a creative solution to these vacancies. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of the outcomes of the pandemic is not just more flexibility, but that not everybody wants to work full time. I have a 23-year-old son who said to me recently, I'm not getting a 9-to-5 job like you guys. Like, I'm doing something different. And I think he's thinking more about the gig economy, but I do think younger workers are more open to piecing things together. Janelle.
Hi, thank you for all of this. It's really helpful.
Wow.
I run a performing and visual arts organization, and so we're still recovering from the pandemic, as many of us are. But something that we are looking at is unlimited PTO. To provide more flexibility to folks for that, and also, except for the executive director, I've instituted a 32-hour full-time week. Which is particularly important to me as an arts organization, because we like to hire people who are also artists, and we like for them to have the opportunity to be connected to their community and their practice, because I think that further enlivens our organization. But a 40-hour a week job, it does, like you said about your son, it really cuts into your life in a way that's really different than I think it was in the past, with the way that people commute and the way communities are spread out. So those are two things that we have. I wish one of them was health insurance, but we're not there yet. But those are a couple of things.
Thanks for sharing that. I have a client, they're also in the arts, who's recently gone down to a 35-hour, I think, work week, but 4 days, with the same idea of giving people opportunities to explore their other passions. And then I was on a board of an organization that was just really financially strapped, and they were paying people as well as they could, but staff were feeling they needed to get a second job. And so they also went to a 4-day full-time work week, so that if people needed to work another job, they could. And recognizing that was not sustainable long-term, but in the moment, that's what they needed to do. And that was very well received by those staff. What else have people tried or contemplated? Elena.
So I have a question. So given all of the the challenge in terms of recruiting staff, and with compensation levels being a big driver, do you have recommendations for like other types of benefits that groups can offer? I mean, obviously, like you need to do as much as you can on compensation because at the end of the day, like that's the deal breaker for a lot of people, and for a lot of very legitimate reasons. But are there other things, right, that you're seeing organizations do to make themselves more appealing to candidates outside of just compensation?
Yeah, so I'm gonna actually share something and then answer your question. There's some really great work coming out of Class Action. They recently published a report called Staffing the Mission, and I was an advisor on that report. I want to be transparent about that. But one of the things that Class Action is trying to do, Staffing the Mission is trying to do, is really encourage funders to ensure that the organizations they're funding have values aligned employment practices, including at the salary level, and really encouraging that to kind of be one of the criteria that funders use. So in terms of, yes, we want to do as much as we can on salaries, we often hit brick walls because we don't have the funds to do it. And while funders aren't the only answer to that, for sure, I think that's one place we can put some energy. I think that it's worth asking staff what benefits are important to them. Because different people have really different needs and responses. That can open up a can of worms because you'll have, competing needs. But flexibility and time off, I think, are very valuable to people. So that's certainly a place to focus. What I've heard about unlimited PTO, and I haven't ever been an HR director in an organization that had unlimited PTO, and I don't know that I've had any clients that have had that benefit, but what I've heard is that people tend to use it less rather than more. Which doesn't mean that it's not a good thing to offer, but I think if you're going to offer it, it's important to be really clear about what you expect. If you don't take 3 weeks off, in the first 9 months of the year, your supervisor is going to be working with you to take, make a plan or something along the line, so that people are left wondering, well, I want to take 2 weeks off. Is that too much? But to be really clear in the realm within which what you expect people to take time off. Anything else? Well, if we haven't done it yet, we are going to send you a PDF of the slides. And I want to just call your attention to this last slide. I created this when I was thinking about having one more breakout, but decided we wouldn't have time. This would be a time-consuming conversation to have. But there are some questions here that you can kind of work yourself and your organization through as you're thinking about how you might want to respond to the Great Resignation. What do you need to do to better understand why people are leaving? What's 1 or 2 things you can do? It can be really overwhelming to think about all the things you should do, so pick 1 or 2. And how will you take those concrete actions? How will you know if you're successful? How will you communicate with staff about this? And then the idea was you would exchange information with each other. You won't do that, but this can be a guide along with the other data and information in the slides around thinking about how you and your organizations want to respond. Just ask one more time if there are any questions.
I see one in the chat from Suzanne. One thing to consider with part-time employees is eligibility for benefits. How many hours do they need to be eligible? Oh, that's not a question. Sorry,
no, but that is
piece of advice. Yeah,
it is a really important an important point. And some health insurance companies will let you determine that. I was talking to an organization yesterday that swears that they provide health insurance regardless of how few hours someone works. We're talking about getting someone down to 10 hours. I haven't seen that, but I believe them. But often insurance companies will let you determine that. Allison.
I'm having trouble phrasing this, and it's both a question and an observation, but I'm not meaning it as a rhetorical question. As I'm watching peers and peer organizations, it feels like there are a lot of organizations where somebody leaves because of salary or a need for flexibility, and they talk with the employer and they talk with the employer, and the employer says, no, we won't do it. The person then leaves, and then in order to fill the role, the employer needs to make some of the changes that person asked for. And given that there are cases where I've seen people make that move when they would have liked to have stayed at the organization would have liked to have kept them, and it feels like there were these two systemic catches that didn't work. Do you have any thoughts on how organizations can kind of skip that step or fast forward so that if for the people who wanted to stay, they could have, as opposed to you need the sort of systemic change before the individual needs can be met?
Yeah, it's a little Dutch chicken and egg thing. And how maddening is it when someone leaves and then you actually have to make the change anyway? I mean, what I would say to all of you as, leaders in your organizations, if someone comes to you and says they'd rather stay, but they have an offer to leave and they want to take it because of X, Y, or Z, that's an important moment to have a conversation and to really think about, not after they're gone, but to think in that moment what kinds of changes you can make, and to recognize that they will be and they should be precedent setting, whatever changes you're making. If you really lead them specifically just to one person, and particularly if you're not transparent about that, I think you're creating more morale problems in the long run. Suzanne? Suzanne, did you have a question?
Sorry, yes, I have a question about compensation in general. It seems that almost in every nonprofit that I encounter, it's just accepted that nonprofits don't pay well. We're not fairly compensated. We're less than in every situation. And I have such a hard time. I've struggled with it, with pay ranges, the transparency, the whole thing. But comparing that, finding good sources of information, like the TSNE stuff is great, but if it's 5 years old, it's not great. It's not helping me. I wonder if you have sources or if people have any ideas about how they compare and contrast. A lot of our jobs in nonprofits aren't easy to find similar jobs,
Right.
to be able to benchmark them and whatever.
Yeah.
Just counteracting that kind of pill we all swallow, that, oh, I work for a nonprofit, we just don't get paid well. That's it.
Yeah.
I think that really is an underlying concept that helps people move on to something else.
Yep, this has been one of my lifetime passions. It's why we did the compensation work at TSNE. I feel very strongly that in order to sustain a workforce, basically nonprofits are filling this void this is my perspective, that the government should be filling. And there's this void. And so the work is critical that we do. It's critical to our culture, to our society, to our country's well-being. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we accept this narrative that we should just be grateful to have a job where we're making a difference and that we should be underpaid. I think we need to pay people well enough that anyone can choose a lifelong career in the nonprofit sector, regardless of their personal needs, and that we can't pay people so little that only those who are privileged, economically can work in this sector. And we need to pay people enough that they can have a lifelong career so that they can raise families and send kids to college. So I do feel very strongly about that. And there's some writing on my website and also on the TSNE website about that. Vu Le, the writer of the nonprofit AF blog, has a lot of great things to say about that. If you don't read that blog, I really encourage you to. He's brilliant and very funny. And talks a lot about compensation and transparency around compensation in the nonprofit sector. In terms of sources of good data, I think the Nonprofit Times report is probably the best source. It's not cheap, it's a few $100s. It is current and it has a very wide range of positions, not wide enough to probably meet all of our unique positions in our organizations, which is also why TSNE did that report. We were looking for data on the kinds of positions you don't find in more traditional studies. So I think you can find compensation data there, but again, the market data is only valuable to a point, because if salaries are depressed already, comparing ourselves to them isn't necessarily the same as paying people enough to live on and to remain in our organizations or in our sector. So I don't have any great answers, but you've named something that I think is important. And I think anything we can do as employers to get salaries, to boost salaries, particularly the lowest salaries in our organization, will go a long way to sort of moving the whole sector forward around compensation. see one more hand? Okay. Well, thank you for a great conversation. I wish you all luck taking whatever you can from this conversation, from your conversations with each other, to address retention issues in your organizations. And I think it's also helpful to remember this is a moment in time. What we're experiencing is what we're experiencing now. You know, in 12 to 18 to 24 months, we may look back and be in a completely different place. We'll face a whole new set of challenges, but we may have moved beyond these. And that is also part of the nature of life in general, but certainly of life in the nonprofit sector. So I really appreciate you all being here, and also just thank you for all the good work you do. I had a chance to look at the organizations you all represent before we got started, and it's an honor to be here with you. The work you all do is so important, especially now. So keep it up.
Just want to hop in quickly and jump on the thanks bandwagon to thank you all for being here and for joining us this morning, and also to thank Lynn for sharing her expertise with us and all of the fabulous resources and advice that you would shared with us this morning. So appreciative. My colleague Jessica has dropped some links in the chat. If you could take the time to fill out the survey, that would be really appreciated. That'll be shared with Lynn as well as the team on our end. So very helpful to us if you could take the time to do that. We do have a couple other workshops coming up that I just want to flag on March 15th, so next week. We will be having a Power of Equity and Fundraising session, and on April 7th, we'll be running a Reinventing Volunteer Engagement in Response to COVID-19 session as well, and you can find both of those sessions on our webpage. Hope to see you all again, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Bye.